We are continuing our discussion of Hume today by looking at two chapters from Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, uh, which is in this book right here. Our textbook does not include these chapters of Hume, although through the textbook website they do make a printout available, so fill some gaps. But in any case, we are looking at what I'm calling Hume's challenges for natural theology. So whereas we've seen a lot of arguments about the nature of God and the existence of God, Hume is going to argue here that our knowledge of the nature and existence of God is less certain than these other philosophers would have us believe. So recall way earlier in the term when we were warming up for early modern philosophy by talking about St. Thomas Aquinas. When we're doing natural theology, what we're trying to do is establish claims about God's existence and nature on the basis of common knowledge, that is, information that anybody could observe, and reason. So our plan for today is to look at some challenges for this view that we can know God's existence and nature simply through observation and reason. So I'm actually going to take things in reverse order. So we're going to look at Hume's challenge for what's sometimes called the teleological argument first. And then we'll look at Hume's famous treatment of miracles and testimony. So first, let's think about the teleological argument. We've seen versions of the teleological argument come up in this course already. So for instance, Leibniz seems to make some attempts at a teleological argument. We also see it in Descartes, when Descartes says that my idea of God has the mark of a craftsman to it. Here's a passage from Locke. Locke says, if matter were the first cogitative, that is, thinking being, there would not be an eternal thinking being, but an infinite number of eternal finite cogitative beings, independent of limited force. But Locke points out that if we had very many finite cogitative beings, we would never find the order, harmony, and beauty which are to be found in nature. Right? So this idea that nature is full of order, harmony, and beauty is suggestive of this line of thought, which says, look, we look out there in the world and we see it to be designed. So this is how the teleological argument goes. Remember, teleological just means something having a telos, an end or a purpose. And here's what the argument says. It says that nature appears to be intelligently designed. And two, if something looks to be designed, it's reasonable to believe that it has a designer. So therefore, if nature looks to be designed, then we can attribute a designer to nature, that is, God. So this is a common line of thought. Maybe you've also heard this famous version of the teleological argument, which says something like this. If you find a watch on the beach, you would reasonably conclude that somebody made that watch and that somebody has been here recently. And then they're going to say, look, you know, it's even more complicated and more beautiful and more expertly designed, apparently, than a watch is the human eyeball. Right? So we might say, look, that would indicate that there is an intelligent designer, not only to things like watches, but also to human beings and their human bodies. So in chapter 11 of the Enquiry, Hume is thinking about this argument, and he frames his criticisms of that argument in the form of a dialogue. So Hume has us imagine a conversation with his Epicurean friend. So an Epicurean is a follower of this guy right here, Epicurus, an ancient philosopher, who believed that, you know, what's really good in life is pleasure, what's really bad in life is pain, and what you should aim for in life is inner peace. Epicurus also famously argued that death isn't bad for you because there's nothing it's like to be dead. Epicurus gives us an early version of the problem of evil, and is also considered a materialist, that is, an atomist about nature. Everything is little bits of indivisible matter in motion. Now, here we see that we're going to be taking up the teleological argument. Religious philosophers paint in the most magnificent colors the order, beauty, and wise arrangement of the universe, and ask if such a glorious display of intelligence could proceed from the fortuitous concourse of atoms, or if it would chance to produce what the greatest genius could never sufficiently admire. So the beauty and complicatedness of nature is indication that somebody smarter than you or I must be the designer of it. So this is a line of thought that Hume's Epicurean friend is going to raise a criticism for. So now we can actually see the Epicurean friend sort of using certain Hume-inspired lines of thought. That when we make the teleological argument, we are drawing from effects to causes. So we observe some effect in nature. It could be something like the beauty of the human eyeball. And then in thought, we infer a cause. Like the solid line might be, the actual causal link. But the E, and this dotted line I'm drawing back to it, that's what we're imagining, or that's what we're thinking, or that's what we're coming up with, right? So, when we're looking for a cause, here's what the Epicurean friend says. If a cause assigned to an effect be not sufficient to produce it, we must either reject the cause or add to it such qualities that give it a just proportion to the effect. So we're saying, look, when we start to figure out what caused an effect, we have to figure out what is going to be needed in order to actually produce this effect. He says further, but if we ascribe to it farther qualities or affirm it capable of producing other effects, we can only indulge the license of conjecture. So here's the idea. We might think that there are a lot of effects where we can draw explanations for them. So for instance, we might see the leaves falling on the trees. That's what's been going on this autumn. And we might say, like, look, what explains this? Well, we might say something like, well, the trees are responding to the way that the air is getting colder, right? So that might be a way in which we figure out what will be sufficient to bring the leaves off the trees. And maybe it's that it gets below 30 degrees at night, or something like that, right? But here's the thought, is that, if we know that it has to get below 30 degrees in order for leaves to fall off of the trees, well, we don't have evidence that it has yet been 25 degrees at night here, right? So the idea is, once we get more specific, or once we get too specific about the causes of certain effects, we are indulging the license of conjecture. Well, what does that mean? Well, indulging the license of conjecture is a way to talk in a fancy way about acting in a way or inferring things that is more of a guess, right? So if I, see leaves falling off the trees and I know that that means that the temperature has gotten below 30, I would be conjecturing, I would be guessing if I said that is evidence that it has been 20 degrees outside, right? So here's the idea. If a weight tips a scale, we can know some things, right? We can know that the weight on the scale is sufficient to tip it. But we can't really make any inferences about the specific weight of what we just used to tip the scale. So the thought is, you can infer whatever causes are necessary for an effect, but you can't infer anything more than that. So how does this apply to the teleological argument? Well, in the teleological argument, philosophers are making claims often about providence, right? So providence is this thought that in the future, God is going to bring about good things, and that God will reward good people and punish the bad people, right? So here's what the Epicurean friend sees as going on in these arguments about providence. Well, you observe an effect, you infer a cause of that effect, and then you project into the future what that cause is going to do. So the way that the Epicurean friend is thinking about this, when we take all of these steps in our inference, we observe an effect, infer a cause, and then we project into the future. Well, all these steps in reasoning are adding to the phenomenon of a single particular. So simply observing that sometimes bad people get their comeuppance is not yet evidence that in the future all bad actions are going to get their comeuppance, right? Or, we can point out that just because we observe that it rained today and we infer that it was caused by a certain level of humidity, well, we don't really know what that's going to tell us about the future. Maybe it'll rain again the next day, but maybe the humidity will lower off again. So we don't want to engage in what the Epicurean friend of Hume, which is really sort of a voice box for Hume, we don't want to be engaging in what they call conjecture. So even if we see a lot of good deeds rewarded, bad deeds punished, the thought here is by projecting into the future, we are making claims about things that we don't have enough evidence for yet. Okay, so in this way, we can see that this can function as a critique of the teleological argument. So let's move on to the chapter 10 criticism of natural theology. Now that we've critiqued the teleological argument, let's think about miracles. When we form our religious beliefs, Hume is going to say that an important part of how we form our religious beliefs is based on what he says, the testimony of the apostles, right? So the question is going to be, how do we know that Jesus died and then rose from the dead with resurrection, right? He said that everybody's going to acknowledge that part of how we know this is what we've heard the apostles say, right? So that is, some people were eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection, and then those eyewitnesses told some other people, those people told some other people, and eventually that particular miracle, right, the miracle of Jesus' resurrection, then makes it into the Bible, and by reading the Bible, this is how we learn about the resurrection. Now, once we grasp this point, we're saying, like, look, we've got a certain kind of evidence for this matter-of-fact claim, and that matter-of-fact claim is the suggestion that Jesus rose from the dead on the basis of testimony. Well, Hume is going to point out that this kind of reasoning can be erroneous, right? So we know that, sometimes your sight will deceive you a little bit. Sometimes what people say to you will deceive you. Sometimes you might even be hallucinating, right? Further example, weather, right? when we reason about matters of fact, we can usually assume that the weather will be warmer in June than it will be in December, right? That we have a lot of experience and a lot of people reasonably believe this, although we also know that uh, this is not perfect evidence and weird stuff happens, especially with climate change nowadays. You could have a very warm day in December. It could hit 70 in December, for instance. And you could have a very cold day in June. Could get down to 60 in June. And then, this reasonable inference you make about the weather that, December days are going to be colder than June days. Well, sometimes those assumptions will be confounded, right? And so here's like a simple rule that Hume gives us for what you should believe and how fervently you should believe it. He's going to tell us that in the context of thinking about matters of fact with different kinds of evidence, uh, the wise man, therefore, is going to proportion their belief to their evidence. So uh, if you have really good evidence for something, like that I am sitting in my backyard and looking at my hand at the moment, that's really good evidence, right? Uh, but if we're going to try to make predictions about the weather or sports or something like that, well, we should realize that the evidence when it comes to things like weather or whether your favorite sports team is going to win the championship this year, the evidence is much more dicey in those cases. So what Hume is pointing out here is that when it comes to religion, testimony is important, uh, and it's a useful and necessary means for forming knowledge, right? So Hume is not saying that we should just throw out all testimony. For instance, we use testimony to know science, to learn basic facts about the world, to coordinate activities with our friends, right? Uh, but even though it's a useful and important means for forming knowledge, it's not a perfect means of knowledge, right? There isn't a necessary connection between what people are saying and the actual truth of what they're saying. And he points out that if a person is in a state of delirium, right, we wouldn't necessarily trust them. So in this way, Hume is going to say that testimony, it's probabilistic. It is a function of a speaker's trustworthiness. So this is where Hume's theory of miracles comes in. Well, he's going to say that once we realize that testimony should only be believed in proportion to its reliability, he's going to say that, well, this is going to be really hard when we start thinking about miracles, because a miracle for Hume is a violation of the laws of nature. And when we're talking about laws of nature, this is the stuff that we have constant conjunction to demonstrate, right? So we have constant conjunction when it comes to something like the laws of gravity working, right? And experience has sort of established these laws to be airtight. Our experience and knowledge and certainty about, say, the laws of gravitation are much stronger than the evidence that you have for instance, your favorite sports team being liable to win this next year, right? Now, he's pointing out that we have really strong evidence for the laws of nature, and it could be so strong that it could be a really strong reason to not believe in miracles, right? So he's going to say that this argument is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. In footnote 2, he points out that a miracle may be defined as a transgression of the laws of nature by a particular volition of the deity, or by the interposition of some agent. So what he's saying here is like, look, we have really strong evidence for the laws of nature. And because we have such strong evidence, that's going to make it really hard to believe in the violation of miracles. Now, here's one interpretation that some people pull out of what Hume is saying here. And they say, look, Hume is saying, like, look, a miracle violates the laws of nature, but to be a law of nature, something has to be necessary, right? So it's impossible that a miracle could ever happen. Now, if this were Hume's argument, it wouldn't be a very good argument. But you know, this argument is just arguing against the existence of miracles on the basis of definitions, right? Saying, look, to be a miracle is to be a violation of a law of nature, but to be a law of nature, it has to be inviolable. I don't think that this is Hume's actual argument, even though some people tend to see this in Hume's argument. Here's a couple of things that Hume is going to note. One thing is that he doesn't think that the laws of nature are a necessity. Remember, he doesn't think that the laws of nature are relations of ideas, but rather they're matters of fact. And matters of fact might not be true, right? You know that laws of nature are true only through constant conjunction. Even if we look at this passage, Hume is not saying it's an argument from relations of ideas or concepts. He's saying it's an argument from experience. And to know something via experience is to be a posteriori, not a priori. So here's what I think that Hume's actual argument is trying to say. He says, we have evidence for the laws of nature. And our evidence for those laws of nature are constant conjunction, right? So if we want to know about the laws of gravitation, well, we say, like, look, I'm going to hold this copy of Hume's Enquiries in the air, and when I let go of it, so it's no longer supported in the air, it falls, right? And this constant conjunction suggests that, look, that's how we come to believe that gravitation works so fervently, is we see it working constantly, right? Then he's going to say, look, but when people tell us about miracles, they're telling us about violations of the laws of nature. And these are violations of the laws of nature that are happening on the basis of testimony. Then he's going to point out that evidence based on experience of constant conjunction is a stronger form of evidence than evidence based on testimony. So he's going to say that our evidence for miracles is going to be weaker than our evidence for the laws of nature. So we might say, look, you have the choice of either believing what you see and hear constantly throughout the course of your entire life, or you're going to take somebody's word that the most likely thing in the world is false. So here's how Hume puts it. He says, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony is of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. But he's going to point out that most of the time, testimony is not as reliable as what we're trying to establish. Because testimony is pretty unreliable in a number of ways. So here are some things that Hume points out. He says that there are not any miracles reported in the history of in recorded history that a sufficient number of people attest to. Two, he points out that, look, when people talk about miracles, we should realize something more generally about how people talk. He says that the passions of surprise and wonder make people want to tell one another about strange events. It feels really good to tell people about that crazy thing you saw or heard about. This is even the case in non-miraculous situations. So gossip can spread through a town really quickly about a marriage because people get really excited about telling somebody else a surprising story. Here's a claim that Hume makes. He says that testimony about miracles is most prevalent among ignorant and barbarous nations. Um, we can worry about maybe a bit of cultural imperialism in this claim, but Hume does seem to observe that the more civilized and educated a culture becomes, the less testimony about miracles we find within it. He further points out that accepting that there are miracles attested in one case is going to implicitly suggest that all other non-compatible testimony about other miracles is unreliable. So here's the line of thought there. He's going to say a lot of testimony about miracles is testimony that's supposed to establish one particular religion as the one true religion and all the other religions as the one false religion. Well, Hume is going to point out if you're going to do that, you're going to have to say all those other testimonies about miracles are false. But my testimony about miracles is true. Here's how he puts it. In another place, he says, in matters of religion, whatever is different is contrary. And it's impossible that the religions of ancient Rome, of Turkey, of Siam, and of China should all of them be established on any solid foundation, because every miracle pretended to have wrought in any of these religions, and all of those religions abound in miracles, as its direct scope is to establish that the particular system which it is attributed, so that it has the same force, though more indirectly, to overthrow every other system. So if we look at the religion of Rome, the Romans are going to say, we observed a miracle in our case, but the people in Turkey, Siam, and China are mistaken. And every other place and religion is going to make the same claim about their religion or their testimony about miracles as reliable and superior, the other ones as unreliable and inferior. Now, what do we do about this kind of disagreement? Well, Hume points out that in a non-religious case, if a judge is getting a bunch of competing testimony, and 4 witnesses are saying 4 things, and only one witness could possibly be telling us the truth, well, in that case, the judge would probably just throw out all the witnesses' testimonies. Now, Hume goes pretty extreme with this. Not only does he say that other people's testimonies about the laws of nature are not sufficient to overthrow the laws of nature, Hume is further going to say that even if we did have really clear testimony, we would have a hard time believing it. So he said, imagine we got unbiased and independent reports that the whole world fell into darkness on January 1st, 1600. We would believe it. But he's also going to say, we ought to receive it as certain and then search for the causes from which that event might be derived. So there he's going to say, look, if you hear about this crazy thing that happened, you should still search for natural causes rather than miraculous causes. Now he does throw in, if there were reports that Queen Elizabeth I rose from the dead, he thinks that even if 100 people were relating this, he thinks that it would be more reasonable in that situation to think that the death was faked. And it would seem here that Hume is basically asserting that he really, really believes in the laws of nature. Nothing is more certain to him. And even if we get really strong evidence that undercuts the laws of nature, tells us that there's a miracle happening, we should stick with the laws of nature. Now, there's an example that comes in Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, where Scrooge is first woken by the first ghost, and this is the ghost of Jacob Marley, his former business associate. And what Scrooge says in this situation is that you're not a real ghost, I'm just dreaming. Uh, you could be just, a hallucination brought on by some, and he says, some undigested beef in my tummy. He says, there's more gravy than grave about you, Marley. And, uh, this is Scrooge's way of saying, look, uh, if I observe something so ridiculous, so miraculous, um, the first thing to do is not to just believe this experience of the miraculous, but instead, what we should do is think that we are hallucinating, right? So here's a worry. Here's a worry. And the worry is this. If there were a miracle staring Hume straight in the face, not only would he would never take somebody's word for it because he thinks that experience is more reliable than testimony, but he might even say, look, if he has a momentary experience of a miracle, he's going to say, actually, my personal experience in this moment is less good data about whether miracles happen than my lifetime of experience where they don't happen, such that I should distrust my own experience. So that is, even if the testimony were really good, Hume would not believe that a miracle has been sufficiently established. Now, this is the way in which Hume thinks another avenue for establishing knowledge about the existence and nature of God is undercut. Now, in a couple of places, Hume will go on to say, well, this shows that we should believe religious claims not through reason, not as a matter of natural theology, but through faith. Right? Now, in some ways, this is perhaps a legitimate philosophical approach. We might say there are some things that you could still reasonably hope for and expect, even if you can't prove them. But part of what Hume is doing here is he's being a little sneaky, right? In his time, he knew that he couldn't just say that religious views are false. So he simply said that, well, the attempt that philosophers like Aquinas or Descartes made to do natural theology cannot succeed. So if you're going to keep believing in God, you should do it on the basis of faith rather than convincing yourself you can do it on the basis of reason. But we've seen here today 2 challenges from Hume against natural theology. Thanks for listening in, and we'll pick things up again soon.